The T-55 tank is something like an AK-47, a reliable and cheap weapon produced in huge numbers that does its job and can be acquired cheaply. However, being the most produced tank ever, serving in over 70 countries and with the longest operational history still ongoing today, this tank has some serious stories behind it. Today we're going to talk about them, as well as what it's like to be its crew member, especially in modern times. Let's begin. The T-55 tank rolled off the production lines for the first time in 1955, and today, 70 years later, it is still on the battlefield. It is the most produced tank of all time, with around 100,000 units built, with numerous upgrades and modifications. After World War II, the Soviet Union wanted to replace its aging T-34s with something better armored, better armed, and adaptable for future conflicts. The first step was the short-lived T-44, then came the T-54, built on a new concept but plagued by many flaws and issues. The T-55 was developed to fix those problems, and it would go on to conquer the world, at least in numbers. The T-55 is similar to the T-34 when you look at it on paper. Cheap and easy to produce in great numbers, with a powerful gun that could threaten all opposing tanks, along with great mobility. But in real life, many of those characteristics didn't actually help much when it came to crew safety and comfort. The T-55 weighs just 36 tons, which is 15 to 20 tons less than Western tanks, and it has a significantly lower silhouette, making it a smaller and harder to hit target. However, this also made the interior immensely cramped for the 4 crew members, 3 of whom were tightly packed into the turret. You'll see why the Soviets had a height limit for their tankers of 170 centimeters, or 5'8". The gunner perhaps had the best, or better said, the least bad, space inside. He shared a hatch with the tank commander, who was literally standing on top of him. These two were so close together that the tank commander could actually use the gunner's controls just by bending forward. The commander was crammed between the turret wall and the gun breech, barely able to move left or right. On the other side of the gun breech was the loader, who besides having absolutely no space for himself, had to load 70-pound shells that were stacked all over the tank. There was no automated loading system, meaning he couldn't develop a consistent movement for sustained fire, as almost every shell was positioned differently. On top of that, he had to load them mostly from the left side, which didn't suit most right-handed loaders. He couldn't stand straight due to the way shells were stored around him. 2 main methods were used for loading, one while standing, the other sitting, but both were far from comfortable. The gun breech recoiled way back after firing, putting the loader in serious danger. There is a case where a loader had his jaw broken in 11 places after being hit by the recoiling breech. An interesting feature was that instead of the loader's periscope, a snorkel device could be mounted, allowing the tank to cross water up to 18 feet deep by driving along the bottom. The crew had to undergo special training for this, and it was far from a fun or safe activity, as many things could go wrong under the water while you're in a metal box. The gun was actually carried over from the Su-100 self-propelled gun. It could carry 43 shells of different types for its 100mm rifled gun, which could penetrate the front plate of a Leopard at 2,000 meters. Heat rounds were particularly effective and feared, and the gun could even use the Bastion system, firing anti-tank guided missiles. These missiles were fired from the tank's gun and then guided to their target by laser, making them very effective for long-range tank-on-tank combat. However, they were only available on upgraded versions and were rarely used in real combat due to their scarcity. The gun had issues with sustained fire, as it would quickly overheat and lose accuracy. However, its optics were good and very accurate, making it excellent for first-shot kills. It also had an infrared projector, which was new for the time and provided an advantage in night combat up to around 400 yards. But this technology quickly became outdated. One of the gun's biggest disadvantages was its limited depression angle compared to Western tanks, making it difficult to fire effectively from cover, and the turret traverse was notoriously slow. The T-55 was said to be very easy to drive and operate, and depending on when and where it saw action, it was both loved and hated by its crews. With wide tracks and a relatively low weight, it could traverse terrain where Western tanks would often get stuck. The tank had good heaters, but the ventilation inside the turret was described by crews as the worst imaginable. It was likely designed with Soviet winters in mind, not the extreme heat of deserts and jungles, yet it saw heavy action in the Middle East and Africa. Operating the T-55 in such climates was pure torture for its crews, with interior temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. On top of that, the fume extractor was positioned at the very end of the barrel and was not particularly effective. Around 50% of the fumes from fired round would be released inside the turret when the breech was opened. Prolonged combat with closed hatches was impossible, as thick black smoke would quickly fill the interior, burning the eyes and lungs of the crew. Auxiliary fuel tanks allowed the T-55 to carry up to 1,000 liters of fuel. These external tanks were mounted on the rear of the hull, and crews would typically use them first while driving outside combat zones before switching to the protected internal fuel tanks during battle. However, there were cases where enemy fire from heavy machine guns with incendiary rounds ignited the fuel dripping over the tank and posed a serious risk to both the engine and crew. Once Western main battle tanks upgraded their guns to 105mm, such as in the Centurion and M60 pattern, the T-55's armor could be penetrated from any angle at any combat range. In fact, it could even be argued that the T-55 itself was responsible for prompting this upgrade. During the Hungarian uprising against Soviet control, the T-55 saw its first combat action, having been introduced only a year earlier. At the time, it was the most advanced tank in Soviet service. One T-55 was captured intact by Hungarian rebels, who then drove it to the British Embassy, where Western intelligence was able to examine it closely. The tank's 100mm gun, improved armor, and revolutionary nuclear, biological, and chemical protection system shocked the West, as it was far ahead of NATO's tanks in several aspects. At the time, NATO's main battle tanks were the M48 Patton and Centurion, still equipped with 90 and 84mm guns. In response to the T-55, NATO quickly developed the 105mm L7 gun, which was later adopted by many Western tanks like the Centurion, Leopard 1, and M60 Patton. During the Cold War, the primary concern was the emergence of nuclear and biological weapons, and tanks were expected to operate in highly radioactive or contaminated environments if such weapons were used. The T-55 was one of the first tanks designed with this in mind, featuring a pressurized cabin to prevent contaminated air from entering and radiation shields on the sights. Crews were also trained to operate the tank while wearing gas masks, which was far from a comfortable experience. It is often said that the T-55 became obsolete by the mid-1960s, but for some reason it still remains in service to this day, with various upgrades desperately trying to keep it relevant on the modern battlefield. So how is a tank that was essentially a product of World War II doctrine still fighting today, when even the most modern tanks struggle to defend themselves against advanced anti-tank weapons? It might surprise you that T-55s are still being sold around the world, but who buys them and why? For example, in 2019, Pakistan purchased upgraded and modernized T-55s from Serbia, which had a large stockpile left over from communist Yugoslavia. They wanted to replace their aging Type 69s, which were essentially improved Chinese copies of the T-55 for counterinsurgency operations. This Serbian T-55 variant had explosive reactive armor, which was supposedly superior to the well-known Contact 1, providing some protection against weapons like the RPG-7. It was fitted with an upgraded fire control system, dramatically improving the old system with an integrated night vision, a laser rangefinder, and several other upgrades in communications and equipment. So having any tank is better than having no tank, and if you can give a fighting chance to a large number of already available older tanks, it's certainly better than nothing. Take the Chinese Super 59, for example. This is an extensively upgraded version of the Type 59, which itself was a downgraded Chinese copy of the T-54A, an even less capable version than the T-55. However, instead of scrapping these obsolete tanks, which had been well outclassed since the 1970s, they were modernized to such an extent that they became something entirely different. Beneath all the upgrades, it's still the same old hull, but now it carries a modern 125mm smoothbore gun, a digital fire control system, an engine nearly twice as powerful as the original, and massively improved armor. With add-on composite and explosive reactive armor, its front armor is rated at an equivalent of 500mm of rolled homogeneous armor, still a respectable level of protection even by today's standards. As you can see, the T-55 continues to evolve and is still actively used in major conflicts today, including in Ukraine, something that cannot be said for any other tank of its era. And the way things are going, we'll probably continue to see it for quite some time. What are your thoughts?